Welcome everyone to our final event during the Children's Media Association's Climate Literacy Week. Our first event was an eco screen where we showcased content with an eco-conscious focus and met the talented creators of that content. Our second event focused on kids and climate action, where we discussed the importance of acknowledging the feelings that kids have around climate change, but also the policy changes that need to happen, the climate education our kids, our families, and our schools so desperately need to implement. All of those panels, including today's, will be available on our research and insights page on the Children's Media Association's website. And we're also streaming once again live on LinkedIn. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please add them there. We've had an inspiring week, and today we're focusing our conversation on green media, the importance of media that includes green storylines, interactive media that's cultivating our next generation of eco-conscious advocates, and green productions, our goal being to inspire the community and provide resources to reduce our industry's carbon footprint. We have a super panel of guests joining us today, so let's have them enter the studio. All right, great. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're joined by Tovah Barocas, the president of Earth Rangers, Meredith Milton, the creative director for Rewrite the Future at NRDC, Allison Begalman, the founder and CEO of Youth Entertainment Activists, Jacob Corvidae, a principal at RMI who developed the Lights, Camera, Clean Energy Guide that we featured in our report. So welcome, everyone. We're super excited to have you here today. I'd love to begin and ask you guys to share a bit about your work in climate change media and what made you decide you needed to get involved in this important issue. Let's start, Tovah. Earth Rangers is a charity that transforms children's concerns about the environment into positive action. Tell us more and sign me up.
Thank you. Yeah, so Earth Rangers is a charity based in Canada, but also just expanded into the United States that's really focused on educating kids about biodiversity and climate change and empowering them to take action. And we use a lot of media to do that. So we've got some really popular podcasts that introduce kids to these issues in a really fun and compelling way. And we have a membership program, which is accessed through the Earth Rangers app, where kids can sign up and then start engaging in environmental activities, accessing a lot of content through the Earth Rangers blog, do environmental trivia, things like that. And as they do actions in the real world, they can level up and kind of become the ultimate Earth Ranger. So it's very fun and positive. We also do live assemblies in about 800 elementary schools every year, also tackling the same issues of, biodiversity, climate change, plastic pollution, all kinds of different issues. And, I think what really differentiates Earth Rangers, or what's really fun about the organization, is it's really a kids brand. The kids are the Earth Rangers, so they feel a lot of affinity and passion for their participation. And we really try to take a positive approach and show them that the impact that they can have.
Absolutely. And how did you join Earth Rangers? What spoke to you about the organization and put you on this path and everything that you've accomplished since being there?
Well, I've been at Earth Rangers for almost 14 years, so it's been really the bulk of my career there. When I had the opportunity to work there all those years ago, I just, it's the cause really spoke to me. I'm really passionate about nature, especially about protected areas and parks. And so it was just the perfect fit. And I've just kind of grown my career there, and it's been very rewarding.
Yeah, it's amazing. Love it. Okay, Meredith, NRDC's Rewrite the Future initiative aims to enlist the power of storytelling to help us turn the climate crisis around. I'm going to read a quote that I got from your website that really spoke to me, and then I'd love for you to share more about the organization. Entertainment reaches across demographics and national borders, and when a good story carries us away, we effortlessly absorb new information, identify with characters who may be very different from us, drop our defenses, and identify and identity group biases, and open our minds and hearts to new ways of thinking and living. That's amazing. Whoever wrote that, check mark. But Meredith, tell us about the Rewrite the Future initiative and how you got involved and your journey with the organization.
Yeah, I'd love to. And thanks for having me here today, Susie. We're really, NRDC is really excited to participate in this event. The NRDC has been around for 50 years. The main core of our work is science, policy, and advocacy. We have about 700 people in offices all over the US and in India and China as well. And Rewrite the Future is a program that started in about 2019 that's part of our communications group, because we recognize that as humans, we already have a lot of the scientific and technological tools that we need to solve the climate crisis. And what we lack, frankly, is the will. And I think that becomes a communications challenge. And so Rewrite the Future was founded because, folks at the NRDC were looking at the content that was coming out of the entertainment industry and realizing that climate change and environmental topics were largely ignored. And that when they did show up, they showed up in predictable places, heavy on documentaries. Obviously, the audiences for that kind of content often self-select, so you're not really converting or changing that many minds when you release compelling documentaries, unfortunately. And then I think, obviously, within the scripted and unscripted space, it's a lot of apocalyptic storytelling. We're all used to the kind of Planet B stories and those kinds of things. And, personally, I think there's a real place for that kind of entertainment. I think there's a lot of incredible work that's been done in that space, but there's so much opportunity to broaden out the way that we deal with climate and environment in storytelling, and really to reflect it in all of the entertainment that we make, because the reality is that it touches everyone and everything and every place in the world. And so reflecting that in big and small ways can help people, process their emotions around the climate crisis, figure out how to take action. I think reflecting solutions is really important. So yes, so that's Rewrite the Future. That's what that's our sort of goal. And then we, in our work, we consult to a lot of the major studios and to content creators, helping them reflect climate and environmental topics in their work. We bring in experts to consult and, serve as inspiration for their work, and also, fact check it to some extent where applicable. And then we have a climate storytelling fellowship that's in its second year, where we select 3 fellows who receive $20,000 stipend, and then we pair them with an industry mentor. So this year's mentors are Pamela Adlon and Roxane Gay and Dorothy Fortenberry. And it's a revision fellowship. So the fellows have the opportunity to work with that writer to revise their script, and also with NRDC experts who give them input on what they've written. So we do, a lot of work in the space. And we worked really closely. NBC Universal just debuted this incredible program called Greenerlight, where they're instituting a review process for all of the films that they greenlight, that essentially looks at the on and off screen sustainability of the project, and they're doing that across their film slate, and they're going to roll it out in television as well. But we worked really closely with them to develop that process. And our hope is that other institutions will consider adopting similar processes. It's analogous in some ways to the review process that a lot of companies now have for DEI.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we shared some content on Saturday it's called Obki. It's a preschool show, and it's from Sky Zero. And they too work to make sure that in front of and behind, it's as green as possible. They have actually put a stake in the ground for when they want to get to a certain level, which I think is very admirable as well. So love that.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, Allison. Youth entertainment activists. Your mission is to help companies, organizations, and individuals create long-term impact change that is not only profitable, but authentic. So we have a shared friend with Morgan that introduced us, so that's wonderful. But tell us about your organization and what you're seeing in the industry. Hopefully that's a positive on some levels, and then some of the challenges that you're seeing as well.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Allison. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the CEO of Impact. We come from the coalition Young Entertainment Activists, which is what I started like 5 years ago, but transitioned into a social impact agency. So, now what we're doing is pairing community organizing with storytelling in order to help companies and also, grassroots coalitions, as well as films, TV shows, communicate their impact initiatives. We work with clients ranging from, nonprofits and other larger entities to someone who reaches out and they need some support with their podcast. Like we want to make sure that we are as accessible as possible and work where the work needs to be done. Our services range from impact campaigns for TV and film. We have several going on right now, as well as partnership building and large scale event production. One of our major events that we actually created and produce every year is called the Hollywood Climate Summit, that now is in its 4th year and has sponsors from Netflix, NBC, Paramount to NRDC, Good Energy, Center for Cultural Power. So, the goal of that is really to bring in every major media and climate stakeholder and provide a platform for community building, because, our belief is like community creates culture. Of course, culture also creates community. So it's a double-edged sword there. But the Hollywood Climate Summit is a cross-sector community space for thousands of entertainment and media professionals to take action on climate. We gather filmmakers, artists, executives, activists, and other experts to exchange ideas, inspire each other's work. And then it takes place in LA. It's going to be June 21st to the 24th this year in person. I can't announce where yet, but it's a very, very, very exciting location and partnership that I think is going to really show the industry and the media landscape that like Hollywood is taking climate seriously and ready to do the work. And like Meredith said, like we have, organizations like NBC that are ready to implement at every single stage. And I think, they're just the first of everyone. And there's so much work in this space to go around. So it's very exciting time. Like ultimately the goal of our work, especially as an impact agency and, a company that works with filmmakers to help implement impact from the beginning and, development stage to the distribution and marketing campaign. Our goal is that media stakeholders and communicators will be more climate literate and have stronger relationships with grassroots social justice movements, especially with the intersectional environmental movement, which is sort of a North Star for our company because climate and, is the most intersectional and pressing issue of our time. And then, obviously it's also creating a business case for Hollywood and media stakeholders to create any sort of property, whether that's a media project or a product, right? It's all interconnected. So, being able to integrate social justice at every phase is a major goal for our company. And that means that, campaigns and impact strategy and all of that is going to be part of the process as well. So yeah, that's sort of our North Star and guiding principles with Impact.
I love it. I want to try and come to the Hollywood Climate Summit this year. I just think, the more we talk about it, the more we bring people together, the more that we show how successful storylines that are imbued with green storytelling and green productions, the more that we will see it come to fruition across all studios. So that's amazing work. Thank you. Jacob, Lights, Camera, Action is a guide integrating clean energy norms into popular television and film production content. This was a collaboration between RMI and PJ's Green Production Guide, providing ideas on using clean energy for character roles and identities from dramatic situations of plot development or even visual effects. So welcome, Jacob. Tell us more about this report and then overall your company and everything that you're doing.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Great to be here and an honor to be here with the rest of the panelists as well. I love all the great work happening here. So basically what we looked at here is the fact that most people's conception of the world is not aligned with the world we actually live in. The future is not going to be the same as what we think reality is now. And in fact, the present is not the same as how most people think of what's happening right now, right? And this is both in ways that are good and bad. On the disturbing side, right, are increases in extreme weather, wildfires, flooding, droughts, all these sorts of problems that are facing us with climate change. But on the positive side is that the clean energy economy is actually happening and is actually dominating the world right now. And the solutions are actually here. They're emerging faster and more cost effectively than most people realize, right? And we talk about this stuff all the time at RMI. RMI, we are a global energy not-for-profit that works on solutions for a clean, prosperous, clean energy, zero carbon future for everybody. And we were looking at this and considering the fact that people don't realize how much things have changed already, much less how they're going to change, and that we really needed to help bring more awareness to that into the media space. And so we were really excited several years ago now that we did the partnership with the Producers Guild, and it was just to try to highlight the opportunity to actually integrate this more seamlessly into programming, right? And as simple as, you've got a sitcom and the next door neighbor shows up and they're a plumber. It's like, great. But what if instead of a plumber, they're a solar installer? What if, these sorts of things? So there's all sorts of things that can be be sort of seamlessly woven in to just create a new normal around our understanding of how the world actually looks right now. And it is about just catching up ideas, right? As it is now, people working in clean energy in the United States, for example, far outnumber the people working in the fossil fuel industry, particularly like coal mining or something like that, right? It's a much bigger part of the economy, but we don't always see that reflected. But the other thing that we talk about a lot at RMI is the real need to help people focus on solutions and not problems. I was really thrilled to see this in Children's Media Association's climate literacy report to really address the fact that especially young people are really grappling with eco-anxiety, climate anxiety. It's amazing the amount of doomerism that we see emerging from this. You know, my own niece recently reached out and said, like, so I just to be clear, like, I understand like the world's basically going to end, right? And I was like, no, it's really not. It's really not going to happen that way. And there are real problems. So we don't want to sugarcoat it, but we have this concept at RMI that we talk about a lot called applied hope, which is to say it's not theoretical hope. It's not mere optimism. It doesn't, no one believes at this point you can just say like, well, I just trust it's going to get better. It's like, no, there's real problems. We really have to work towards them. But as separate from theoretical hope is sort of this concept of applied hope that like we need to find the solutions, roll our sleeves up, be realistic about them, and then dig into them. And then you create this really grounded optimism in what's actually possible for a solution. And that's really the space that we've tried to lean in on here, is providing that. Most of our work is not so like directly consumer facing. We more tend to try to provide the information to the other influencers and folks out there who can then make use of that. And so the report that we did before, shows examples of how folks could incorporate into media. Particularly fun. I remember writing we have a page of different options for ways, just as an example, that these sorts of things could be woven into a show like The Big Bang Theory, right? Like how might this go seamlessly into little one-off things in the background to plot concepts, et cetera, just to give an example that's possible. And we're seeing much more of this emerging now as well in media, which is great. So really excited to see that happen.
Yeah, we love the report. And I think it's sort of the light lifts, whether you're showing an electric car, or whether you're showing, recycling by a family, or like you mentioned, a solar panel installation person. But I do think that one of the biggest challenges we've seen in developing this report is the connecting of the dots. There's a statistic that was released, an analysis of thousands of scripted films and TV episodes made between 2016 and 2020 found that only 2.8% included any climate-related keywords. So I know that we found an amazing amount of truly inspiring and insightful resources. I think the question is, how do we connect all of this and build on it, grow, together, not only as an industry, but as the human race, to think differently about the planet and how we all support it. So Meredith, I'm going to kick this one to you. When developing media on this subject, who should creators reach out to? Like, obviously they can reach out to you, but like, I think the biggest question I see is, well, where do we begin? And hopefully this report demystifies some of the resources, but like, how would you advise a creator to begin that journey to develop something that embraces green production, both in front of and behind the camera?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a lot of great resources out there, and I can highlight some of those. But then I think that the first step, really, like what we've found in our conversations within the business generally, is that there's a kind of a preconception that people have either of what it means to represent climate on screen, or of all of the reasons why they can't or shouldn't, or why it's hard, right? Like there are all of these, there's kind of a prevailing narrative within the business behind the camera that all of the storytellers have kind of convinced themselves of, which is that it's uncommercial or boring or preachy or divisive. And I think that that's really actually doesn't have to be the case. Mm-hmm. And so then you kind of look at the media landscape, and there are lots of really wonderful examples of content that's incorporated climate and environment and been wildly successful, both commercially and creatively. I think, you can point to the Avatar franchise as one of my favorite examples because it's incredibly entertaining, deeply commercial, has resonated with audiences worldwide, the first movie has been the highest grossing movie globally since it was released. Yeah. And it's been a really long time. And to me, that says that audiences connect on a primal level with the struggle to restore balance in nature. And I think that then you can look at other examples. There's a wonderful storyline in Ted Lasso, which is obviously a show about a soccer team or a football team. But, they did a whole storyline about a Nigerian player who figures out that there's, a fossil fuel company polluting his homeland. He takes action. It's, there are lots of really wonderful opportunities of content that's tackled these topics and is really commercial and creatively successful. And I think that the moment that people start to reflect on all of the wonderful examples, the creative light bulbs go on in their imaginations. So yeah, I think here at at Rewrite the Future, we have a lot of resources and we consult on a lot of content. We have a Leave Behind that I can share with you that has just a number of really simple questions that content creators can ask themselves about their own material. Essentially, it's just,
I love that.
Who are your characters? Where do they live? Where do they work? What are their lives like? And the second that you ask those really fundamental questions, just as a human, you start to realize, okay, like this is the air that they're breathing. What could the health impacts of that be? What are they worried about? What's hanging over them? Like, could climate or environmental topics be an obstacle in their lives? I think we've all kind of lived with the impacts of flooding and wildfires and mudslides and all of the things by now. And those can be incorporated into content of all genres. And then I think that the Green Production Guide is an amazing resource for people who are looking at how to sort of execute sustainability, behind the camera. Good Energy Playbook is an incredible resource for people who are looking for just other ways into this kind of content. But, I think the thing that a lot of people forget is like that there is this need to do research and learn about things. But then I think that people forget that like we are all the faces of climate change. If you want to know what it feels like to deal with climate change, look in the mirror. And, anyway. That's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I agree. And I read in an article that, as an industry, we are somewhat detached because so many shows are in another planet, in another world, and we don't really show our planet. And even, I had the privilege to work on Our Planet when I was at Netflix. And when you see how beautiful the world is, and I know that was a doc series and everything, but there's just something that comes alive in you that you want to do more of that and see more of that and hear those stories. So yeah, love that. Thank you. Tovah, a question for you. And Meredith sort of hit on this. Did you find it difficult to get support for everything that you're developing for Earth Rangers? And were people enthusiastic about developing climate change media along with you and offering those resources? Because you're out there doing this, and truly impacting kids, in Canada for sure, but now you're coming to the US and we're going to get lots more Earth Rangers. So what have been some of the pain points or the struggles, or have there been any, in the journey the Earth Rangers has been on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's obviously, and this is in your report as well, and there was a big report that just came out in Canada about kind of the state of climate change in education and in education systems and pedagogy and curriculum and things like that. And so that's a big focus. And sometimes, and I think that is almost like the most critical thing that we need to deal with when dealing with, educating kids and about climate change is kind of dealing with some of those systemic issues in education or more kind of foundational issues. At the same time, though, there are things that we can do in entertainment that can help fill those gaps more quickly because we are reaching kids in a different way. And so making that case can sometimes be a challenge because there's so much work to be done on the education side that on the media side, it might not be viewed as critical. You may have seen an announcement a few weeks ago. Earth Rangers has entered into a partnership with a 9-story media group to develop a television show that's it's being positioned as, graduates of Wildcrats. So for a kind of older kids about, nature, the environment, climate change, etc. And I think, there is recognition that there's a gap, especially in that area for entertainment that really addresses the environment. And also, a big focus for Earth Rangers in particular is this issue of eco-anxiety, which has already been mentioned. And you can't talk about climate change and kids or climate change and people without kind of talking about eco-anxiety and and how kids and youth are feeling about the environment. I really liked what you said about, how to kind of approach that hope and optimism in a more kind of realistic way. So, I mean, all of that to say the Earth Rangers journey, it's our raison d'etre, like it's all we do. So we've had a lot of success in it, but I still think that there is feeling, and, I think Meredith was kind of alluding to this, that to talk about climate change or the environment in media means that the show has to be about that. And that's not true. There's so many ways to incorporate those messages without having it be the entire storyline or the entire purpose of the show. And that's where the real opportunity is, because there's only going to be room for so many, shows, movies, productions that are fully focused on that. But it's such a big part of the world we live in that it really should be seen everywhere.
Yeah. The idea of normalizing, being an eco-conscious person in a story, that's just how they live their life, and not really having it be something that has to be put a big spotlight on. Yeah. Definitely. Okay. Chasing that, Allison, you've been in this space for a while. I'd love your thoughts on how you're seeing things change. What's the hope that keeps, you driving forward? I know I've seen a lot, even just in all the research that we've done. So I can't imagine what you see on a daily basis. But, again, what Jacob said, we definitely don't want to focus on the doom of all of it. We think there is so much hope. There is so much going on. And I'd just love to hear, through your lens, what you've been seeing and what you're most hopeful about.
Yeah, of course. So I think, as I said before, it's like we're definitely in a moment of growth and recognition in terms of climate media. The greater media and entertainment landscape is engaging with climate, thinking about how they can make an impact within their roles, right? Of course, thinking individually, but thinking about you as an individual within the system. And, the fact that organizations like mine can literally specify in climate as our expertise and get a lot of work. It sort of is telling in good and bad ways, right? And so I think for us, we are just trying to keep up with the demand and also, continue to be part of the movement, because I think in the social impact entertainment space, which is sort of what Impact grew out of, and then to specialize in climate and become also part of the climate space, what I noticed is a lot of people who say, oh, I run a social impact agency, and they take on projects of every issue. And I just don't think, unless you are the largest organization in the world with people that specialize in every issue and seeds in all of these movements, you're not going to be as impactful if you aren't really specializing in a few specific areas. And so I think like what I'm hoping to see over the next few years within this space is, that producers and production companies and studios that want to work with specific companies on impact, right? They want to hire and, someone to do their impact campaign or do their story development or whatever, go to the organizations that specialize in those issues. And just because, at the end of the day, like, there's this really great quote from Hassan Minhaj, and he's talking about like, everyone needs to pick three things like not to care about. And so I think like there's a weight of the world is on us right now. And like, I'm 29 years old. I really do feel this fear that and also just like a bleakness about my future, despite having hope and despite all the things that I have working in this industry and working in climate. So I think ultimately it's like, we need to be cool with not taking on every issue and just recognize that like, there's so much more to learn about the expertise that we already have. And that also like most of these issues are intersectional, right? Like climate, human rights is a human rights issue, racial justice, reproductive justice, all of that intersects. So like, look at, if you're going to take on a climate campaign or you're going to take on like specifically reproductive justice campaign, like think about how other issues intersect without, having to take on all of these other issues, if that makes sense. That's sort of how I'm seeing the future. And and the other thing I do want to mention is, so we do a lot of work, like one of our campaigns was for the film I Am Greta. And so obviously following Greta Thunberg, activist, right? So we work with a lot of young activists, and we do a lot of work in terms of the intergenerational, because if you look at a show, even like the recent show Extrapolations that came out, what you're hearing from different generations about their reactions to the show is very interesting. Like people will come to me and ask, what I saw of the show, and then ask an older person, someone I would say in their 50s and 60s, and they will feel very differently. I would say young people react to it in an almost, like not tragic way, but they see it very dark because they know that this is their future. And I think, building spaces where folks can talk and like creating, content that's multi-generational, right? That's going to be super impactful because then the generations are going to be coming together and sharing empathy and really understanding where each other's at. And like, in my opinion, if older generations, the folks that are like running the planet, understood young people, like really tried to like see them as equals in a lot of senses. Like I think, and I see this way about corporate America too, and about the folks running Hollywood. Like if there were more equality between generations, we would not be having a lot of the issues that we have in the world and in this industry. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, equality and even dialogue, right? Conversation, so that there's a seat at the table to have that important conversation. We talked about this in an earlier panel that, this is not a burden for youth. This is a burden for all humans. And just because you're older and, your lifetime and might not see the full impact of it, we all have to work now to create change and to impact everything that's going on. We, as Meredith, you mentioned, we are also fans of Anna Jane Joyner's Good Energy's work, and she shared her thoughts on storytelling in the New York Times recently. And she said, the reason that humans started telling stories many tens of thousands of years ago was essentially to grapple with the difficulty of being alive. And then she asked, so why are we not talking about what could be the biggest difficulty of all time, climate change? So Jacob, leaning into that, what are some of the common misconceptions and challenges about developing climate change media that would be useful for other media professionals to know? What brings you hope in this space? Because I just love what you said earlier, which was applied hope. I love that. So I want to know more, and I want to, jump on that train with you, but I would just love your insights in all of that, because I do think storytelling as a medium is something that can change minds and hearts and really something that can create the impact that we need right now in terms of climate change.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great topic, and I would love to hear others' thoughts on this as well. And I also just want to say before I go into, I think, Allison, I really appreciate you highlighting this generational divide. Obviously, it's a sweeping generalization. Not everyone in any part of that fits, but we see it so often, time and time again, that people who are in positions of power often do not realize how front and center all of these issues are for younger people in America, especially, and I think across the world, really. So yeah, I mean, a few things come to mind in terms of some of the challenges here and that I've seen in this. One is I do think people sometimes grapple with the idea that children's media particularly needs to be simplistic. And I just don't think I think there's a degree for all of us, all human beings, that in some ways, the simpler the message, the more we absorb it. But that's different from being simplistic, right? These are complex things. And I think we do the things that really inspire me are the things that actually give young people a chance to grapple with the complexities. They understand these things are complex, right? And they can actually be incredible advocates and incredible thinkers wrestling with those complexities. I think another challenge that I see here sometimes is I think it's particularly in children's media, I often see a reversion to assuming if it's about the environment or climate somehow, it's all about nature. And I think obviously, one of the things that's great about that is we all love nature. It's very front and center for kids. It's something very tangible we can think about, but it often perpetuates this idea that nature is something out there, right? Once people pass the age of 20, I've rarely seen anyone make a major life decision based on a polar bear. As much as I love the polar bears and want to see them do well, right? But it often becomes this divide of like, there's nature out there, and then there's the life I'm living here, and they're separate things somehow. And I think bridging that divide becomes really important. And I do think thinking about the solution space is one of the ways to do that, because so much of what we need to do is about changing the clean energy infrastructure of this world, how we get around. And those are simple things like how we live in houses, how we move around in cars or e-bikes or, buses and trains, et cetera, how we grow food, these very fundamental things, but it's really changing how that's happening from everything from renewable energy to electrified solutions that don't create pollution to even AI enabled things. And I think trying to fuse how we understand nature and technology together to come up with a solution is really useful. And this is a very minor thing from a number of years ago, but I will say there's this great organization called the Biomimicry Institute, which looks at how we're actually able to learn from nature's lessons to develop new technology. And I know they worked with some folks I know to create a children's album years ago called Ask the Planet, which is this fantastic foray into introducing kids to this idea that these technology and nature are not separate pieces. And the album used a lot of humor. And I do think for me, that's one of the key pieces here as well, right? Is how do we actually engage a sense of fun against of humor, even while not making it simplistic, right? We can acknowledge the challenges, get into the joy of actually doing good work is, I think, at the heart of all of this. Kids want to feel useful. My partner and I have been very influenced by a book called Hunt, Gather, Parent, which really looks at, instead of like just creating play zones for kids, how do you get kids involved in actually doing the work of the household? Like kids want to be useful. And I think this challenge calls out a lot of opportunities for that.
And I think that you touched on something really important that I think about a lot, like when we think about the opportunity, particularly with children and storytelling, this idea that we have where we think of ourselves as being separate from nature. We kind of forget that we're animals, forget that we're a part of these larger systems, right? That we're all interconnected. And I think that we have a lot of narratives that are prevailing narratives that get replicated over and over in our storytelling, like this idea of like, someone being self-made, that actually doesn't, that's kind of a fiction. Like actually Malcolm Gladwell has written about this a bunch, right? That none of us are self-made. We're all the product of a series of happy accidents and other people helping us out and lifting us up. And I think that there's an opportunity to really kind of change the narratives that we tell. I think it's interesting also, there's been research about the fact that self-transcendent storytelling is in decline in Western culture. And I think you see that, right, with this sort of really focused inward gaze that a lot of people seem to have, right? We're all taking selfies of ourselves. If you go into a bookshop, the aisles are filled with self-help books, but you don't see a lot of books and a lot of focus on sort of looking out at the world. How can I help? What does collective action look like? And I think that in reality, we're fundamentally social creatures. From the moment that we're born, we aren't like, I don't know, like a herd animal that, hits the ground and runs 10 seconds later. We are dependent on other humans for survival from the moment that we're born. And I think that the opportunity for collective action is ultimately like kind of what we're built for, right? Like we want to be together and do things together and collaborate. But, and that gets reflected in storytelling a lot, but it's also, in a lot of ways absent from our culture. We've kind of lost track of this idea. And the other thing that I think about when I think about what we're all going to need to get through the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years is a tremendous amount of grit and resilience, because we know that a lot of the climate change impacts are baked in at this point. But we also know that the things that we have been doing are working, right? We've already raised our projected, temperature or reduced it by a degree, which is good. But, I think that things are going to get worse before they get better. And I think that it's going to take a lot of resilience and sort of persistence to cope with that transition, right? We're going to be making a lot of the right choices and things are still going to get tougher out there. And I think role modeling that in the stories that we tell, how do you take on something that feels impossible? How do you avoid getting paralyzed in inaction, which I think is a place that a lot of people end up when they think about climate change. They're kind of like, I don't even know what to do about that. And one person can't make a difference. And we need to sort of chip away at a lot of those narratives, because those are the things that trap people in inaction.
No, I do. I think it's such a big topic that so many people are like, how do I help? I think the intention is there. The desire is there to do more, but sometimes it's like, what do I do? How do I do it? Tovah, leaning into what Jacob said in terms of the idea of kids' content being oversimplified, some would say essentially, not being just simple in its knowledge and its sharing. That's something that I think you guys have done tremendously well in terms of truly empowering kids on their journey. And I just love to know how you came about that kind of structure. I don't know if it's okay to call it education, but I think it's kind of education, but that puts it in another ballpark. But like the information and the missions and the reward system that you've built in is truly, creating that bridge to action with the younger generation. We'd love to share a little about that.
Yeah, so many things to say about this. I totally agree about, this idea that things with kids need to be simple. And, Jacob, I could not agree more with what you said. I mean, you can see it in the way that climate change stories are often reflected in media, like, this kind of tendency to fall into tropes, icebergs breaking off, ice shelves collapsing, polar bear on a piece of ice. Like, those are helpful to a point, but they're also not necessarily like the experience that we're all having. And it does create this divide between like what's happening in your own life and, like what climate change means, which I don't think is particularly, helpful. I also, just another kind of challenge, I think, when developing, kids media around climate change is this, tendency to approach it in a good versus evil kind of perspective, which, is also, there's a place for that in storytelling. Obviously, it's a very compelling way to frame something, but not, again, doesn't kind of paint the full picture. Another thing is just this assumption that everyone knows about climate change now and actually understands the science or the scientific consensus. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, every time we would do something about, Earth Rangers really started out focusing mainly on kind of animal conservation, biodiversity. It's been a journey over the last 10 years to really start to shift that and have climate be central to everything we do. And a part of that is a recognition that kids are capable of understanding it. They also need to understand it. And that, natural climate solutions, like there's lots of ways to bring those two issues together, which I think we're doing a better job of just kind of as a society more recently. But we used to always explain the science of climate when we were going to be talking about an action that you can take or telling a climate story. And I find that now we don't as much because there is kind of this assumption that everyone understands it. And I think that that's probably a false assumption. So it's always a good reminder there. Another thing that, I was thinking about as everyone was talking, and especially kind of this issue of the generational divide, is you want to empower kids to feel and know that they can make a difference, but it's also not fair to put the weight of this on them, like that they have to solve this problem. And they also should know that adults are struggling with this also. Like this concept that when kids or, young people express concern, this kind of inherent desire to try to placate or tell them that it's going to be okay, rather than validating those feelings and saying like those fears are completely legitimate and I share them as an adult, and that I also want to make this better, and what can we do now that can also set you up for success in the future, and kind of trying to make it more of a collaborative process, I think is really important. Like that empathy when dealing with those feelings, to me, is one of the most important things, and one of the things that can often be overlooked or just be counterintuitive for parents, educators, adults in general.
And if I could just hop in there, really, I think one thing that's really important, off of that is, as a young person who started a company, who also is a television writer, like fund young people's work. I think that's also so important there. Like ultimately, when I started going out and like letting people know they're starting a company, like most older people basically told me that there's no point, that I just was too young, to this, to that. And there's just is this lack of resourcing, a lack of support for younger artists, younger entrepreneurs, younger innovators. And again, I think like that stems from this feeling of, I don't know, maybe it's apathy. I'm not sure what it is, but I think showing that mutual empathy, being like, yes, I understand. And like, I'm feeling the same ways as you. And like, let's figure this out together instead of putting it on young people. That is pretty much the key in messaging, in my opinion, on like intergenerational.
Yeah. I mean,
I think it's also really helpful when, but I think that, there isn't enough awareness sort of generally in the world about all of the things. I think you were talking about this too, Jacob, like all the things that we're doing that are working, all of the new solutions that are being adopted and like really incredible and impressive. And I think, we're all kind of swimming around in this doom soup, like worried that the world is ending. And we're not hearing a lot about the solutions and about the success stories of climate. And so I think to the extent that those can be reflected, in both our sort of news media that we consume and the entertainment content, that's really helpful, because, you don't want to just say to your child, like, you're right, it's really scary, I'm scared too, we're all doomed. What you want to be pointing to is also, these are all the things that are working.
Right.
Like, these are the things that you can do. And I think that sort of, really helps process helps you move through the emotions instead of just sort of sitting in them.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I tell you, we were even talking as a team, like, can we adopt a school and work with them to implement green practices as a beta and like use it as an example? Like, could the Children's Media Association do that? Like, just, we are so hungry right now as a team to do more. Like, how do we do that? Okay, one last question, and then Caroline, you can jump in and ask the audience questions. Parting thought, right? You guys work day in, day out on this topic. What is the one thing that you would love to see in the next 5 years happen, either in entertainment and, climate change? What is the one thing that you're most hopeful about or most passionate about seeing happen, involved in, that you would like to see happen? I love just those top line thoughts, and then we'll kick it to our audience for some questions. Jacob, you want to start?
I guess this whole conversation is so much fun. I just want to dive in with you all for another few hours.
Right.
So I guess what I would say is actually going to build off of a couple of threads that Allison and Meredith particularly have named here. There's so many good pieces, but like, is how we move out of this sort of individualistic notion of just like, you do this by yourself. I think one of the cool things I've been seeing emerge, and I would love to see more of, is a shift from the personal responsibility angle. It's your job to recycle. It's your job to do this stuff to make it all happen, to understanding that there's a systemic problem that actually needs to be addressed and that people are addressing. And so how do you move into that group mentality, speak of it? And I think if, to Allison's point, that if we actually leaned in more on supporting youth creators in this space, both for their own creations, also to be advisors on these things, we'd see a lot more interesting stuff. And I'll say I personally have been really excited. There's some conversations I've been around a concept called hope punk, which is, and solar punk is another sort of genre here that people talk about sometimes, of like people actually trying to create these positive visions of what the future could be, but not in a way that is, again, naive or simplistic, right? It's like really about how do we bring communities together to struggle through what the struggles of the day are to actually get us there. And I think that grounds even fanciful things in a certain reality that I'd love to see more of.
Oh, I love that. Love that. Okay. Tovah, you want to give us your hopes, dreams on climate?
I mean, I think maybe just to kind of make it really simple and all encompassing, I just think mainstreaming these issues is really like the most important thing, like mainstreaming climate in education, in media, making it not something that kind of sits on the peripheral as one issue, but understanding that it is the issue and it's connected to literally everything that's happening in society right now, and just a better kind of understanding and acknowledgement of that in everything that we do. I mean, that's a pretty lofty goal, but yeah, I think that would be my number one kind of priority and what I would like to see, and what I think, and where I think that we can get to.
And a fundamental goal, right? Like to truly grow at the rate that we all believe we need to. I think that does have to happen. Absolutely. Allison?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, but I guess I'll speak to like entertainment and media professionals here. I think for me, as a community organizer in the space for going on like 11 years now, I think the top thing now is we have the tools and the resources, right? And we have the teams you can hire to help you figure literally anything out. And some of them will do it for free, even though, maybe you should be paying them. But ultimately, we have those people in place. And now it's really up to, us in terms of going to the spaces where other professionals are, where we're going to network, where we're going to build relationships with other people who care about these issues, and seeing it both as, doing social justice work and also doing business, because, we're all so busy. If we can implement this work and not just call it, oh, I volunteer, once a year, like just do it in your work, honestly, then you don't need to feel guilty. You can just be a community organizer and be in the creative economy and in the media industry. And I really think, so I think ultimately my advice would be to reach out. If it's climate, if it's another issue, do a little bit of homework, go to a couple different places and find out, what is the mecca within that issue, and who can I start looking to understand, like, oh, these events I should attend, so then meet the people that I'm going to make other projects with. I think that's just start looking out for that and talking to your friends about what you're doing. Also, just like make friends with an older person if you're young.
Yeah, and I will add that we highlighted a lot of resources in our report on climate literacy, but I'm also going to work with the team to create just writer resources, producer resources on our website so that it's just easy to find. So there's, definitely a place to go to and learn more. All right, Meredith, close us out with these dreams of yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think my dream echoes a lot of your dreams too. I think that there's a silence on this right now that's deafening. People are scared of talking about it. We aren't addressing it in the content that we make, and in our personal lives, there's this weird crippling silence. And I think that silence is never a good thing. And I think that I just want to hear more noise and a different kind of noise also. Because I think that I'm sort of tired of listening in my social life to my friends talking about moving to Canada. It's sort of like we've all leapt to this conclusion that it's hopeless and we can't fix it. So we have to start taking these drastic measures. And I think that we don't, but really it's just the beginning of a real conversation. And I think there's, a degree of, a lot of defense mechanisms that people kind of default into. Sometimes when you talk about climate, people are like, get away from me with your snowflake stuff, and I think that that's a defense mechanism, the same way that being a feminist is like a dirty word that a lot of women won't say. I think it's the same thing around climate activism, and that shame has been kind of put upon this movement very deliberately by a lot of people who want to stop it, who are interested in enforcing the status quo. So I'd like that silence and that to end.
Yeah, and I think too, you've all said it in different ways. Sharing those inspirational stories, whether, like I led a beach cleanup, like whatever it is, but the communication of how we're all trying really hard individually and collectively to help the planet is something that just needs more light of day so that we can all feel like it isn't something that we're, forcing into a story, that it's a natural piece of storytelling, because that's the world that we live in, is where I'd love it to be. Okay, Caroline. Tell us what the questions are.
Lots of audience questions. So I'm just going to bounce it to one person that's directed towards, but feel free to jump in. First one's for Allison. Do you have any advice on finding alternate or nonprofit funding to find a place for climate conscious kids media? In our experience, it can be a heavy lift to get some of the bigger media companies to back climate facing content.
Yes, it is very hard to find funding. Literally, people email me every day and I'm just like, we just need, ultimately, we need a big fund that is going just towards climate narrative and unscripted content, period. So all to say is I hear you, and it's really difficult. I will say that, in terms of strategizing, what I do sometimes is maybe, first of all, don't pitch it as a climate story, pitch it literally as a story. And then, as everyone else has been saying, create really authentic characters, weave climate into it, think about the location, look at NRDC resources and good energy and talk to these people about when you're doing that so that they can help you. Because as someone who's pitched before, they just want to hear the business case. They don't want to hear the vegetables, essentially. They want the chocolate. And then the other thing I'll say is I think we should be leaning on philanthropy right now in terms of the marketing of it all. If you want to create a show that's, a kid show, and you want to bring in an impact strategy there, who knows, maybe there's a philanthropy, and there probably are a couple that would come in and support the impact campaign or support, some sort of piece that sort of helps a studio or production company get on board, because they're oh, okay, because they're always worried about marketing, right? They're just scared that people aren't going to watch it. But if you have proven we're going to work with, Fridays for Future, and they have X amount of subscribers, which is probably in the millions, that's a built-in audience base that they're also going to, know that they have that extra support. So I think there's a lot of really incredible grassroots climate distribution strategies that we're just starting to unpack. And, if anyone wants to ask me questions about that, I'm a little busy right now with the summit, but you can reach out at Allison at impact.com, and I promise to get back eventually.
Yeah, I love that.
If I may, I just want to reiterate what Allison said. I think the really important thing is that the rules of creating successful entertainment have not changed. And being entertaining is the number one thing that your content needs to do. And then I think you do all of the other things around it. And so I think if you're finding yourself having to look for, nonprofit funding for your content, maybe ask yourself why. That might be a really important message. And I think look out at what's working and figure out how you can find the entertaining commercial value that will enable you to tell the story that you want to tell and reach a wider audience.
Yeah, I was just gonna just say that that's exactly the kind of situation with the show that we're working on producing. Like it's a kids comedy at its core. That is and that is hopefully what will make it successful, is that the entertainment is at the core of it, and then everything else is the way that it's being framed, the way that we're approaching that entertainment, the storytelling, etc. But yeah, so I echo that.
Yeah, I mean, great entertainment starts with story. So start with your story and then filter in the other voices that you want and storylines. And yeah. All right, Caroline, what else do we have?
It's kind of going off of that. Tovah, this one's for you. This was touched on a little bit, but what are some films, TV content studios that are doing it right that we can look to for inspiration?
Oh, gosh. I mentioned Wildcrats. I think that's kind of one of the classic great examples. Nature Cat is another one that I think is quite good. There's not that many examples, actually. So, and then there's just kind of individual, I think you're more likely to see a show that just has maybe one episode or touches on it occasionally than actual, examples of kind of series or films that are completely about that. I mean, I think even in the media, in the report that Susie, that you just put out, especially when it comes to feature length films, there's very little for kids.
Very little.
That has anything to do with the environment. So definitely an opportunity there.
Yeah.
But I think that there are also really wonderful examples of stories that have worked. WALL-E, I think, is very much a story about, the aftermath. Obviously, climate change is the backdrop for that. And I think Moana or Rio, obviously the Lorax. But there are examples of mainstream entertainment for families, particularly in animation, that have tackled climate and environmental thematics and been incredibly successful doing it. I actually think it's interesting when you look at the broad spectrum of entertainment, that's one of the areas where you actually see it being done in a way that's very solutions oriented and kind of positive and cathartic. But again, we need more across the board, more.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we highlighted some of the things that are coming out or have come out on Saturday, but Ogki is one, Galapagos X is another that's coming out later this year. And they are shows that are solidly grounded in climate change issues. And, you've got adventurers going out to solve certain issues on every episode. So it can be done, and you have to have those brave people that'll fund it and those people that'll air it, or stream it. But I do think it's, we're hopefully seeing a little bit of a turn the corner and see more of it, which is encouraging and hopeful. Caroline?
So Jacob, this one's for you. Can you speak to some things that businesses and productions can do to make their practices more sustainable?
Yeah. Well, again, the Green Producers Guide has a bunch of great resources on that's listed in the CMA report. So definitely would refer folks to that as a first and foremost thing to look at. But the big one that I would highlight is I think saw this sort of shocking statistic recently that most Americans, when you ask them what's the number one thing they should do to tackle climate change, they say recycling. And recycling is great. It's useful in a number of ways, especially when you're talking about organic waste and composting, that sort of thing. But the truth of the matter is, it's not actually where the game is at for these sorts of things. And it's partly because it's tangible, it's in our hands every day, and there's been huge campaigns around getting us to focus on it, which is fine. But I think the real thing just to drive home, I think for households, for media, for actual production crews, is it's all about the energy. It's all about energy use. It's about how do you heat and cool the buildings. It's about how do you move goods and transportation. You've got a lot of trucks driving around, make them electric. You've got a lot of heating cooling systems, move them to electric heating, for example, right? Like heat pumps and electric vehicles are where all the story is at here. And they also often work better, right? So you can actually get better products that will actually solve what you're going for. It's not about hardships or extra work necessarily.
Yeah, and just to highlight that, I mean, I can't tell you how many sets I've been on with those terrible gas-powered generators where it's so loud and they smell, and you're polluting the set for the people who are on it, you're polluting the neighborhood that you're in. Yeah, it's just, the solutions really are an improvement.
Yeah.
We have one last question. This one's for Meredith. For young people, it can often feel easier to imagine a world irreparably harmed by climate change, i.e. the worlds of The Last of Us, Station 11, etc., than one in which we have made meaningful strides to mitigate its impacts. How can we show young people there are things they can do to help combat this sense of hopelessness?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. I really do. I think, Daniel Heinerfeld, my colleague, and I, at We Are the Future, we talk about this all the time. People can't rise up and demand solutions that they can't imagine. And so I think that what we do at Rewrite very often is work with content creators and help them imagine all of those solutions and, the future worlds where we have addressed a lot of the issues and, where our cities look different, where our energy solutions look different, where the way that we interact with nature is different, where maybe we've accomplished 30 for 30 or maybe even 50 for 50, like allowing nature to be to itself and changing the way that we occupy, our space. So I think that it's all about, bringing those future possibilities, big and small, into a tangible narrative. And I think it looks different for every story. That's the thing that's really important. Look at the story that you're telling and what kind of solutions can you sort of realistically represent that are going to enrich the creative and feel organic to it. But yeah, representing all of that on screen is incredibly important. And I think that we, at NRDC, we have people who are experts in, a whole wide range of practically every topic. We've done this kind of work with creators who are focusing on, animal populations in the natural world and creators who are also focusing on human populations and future cities and civilizations. And I think it's really fun to do it.
I love that. That's amazing. All right. Well, our time is up. We cannot thank you guys enough. This was once again inspiring, informative, and so full of hope for where we should be focusing and what we should be looking at doing in the future. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. And that's the end of our broadcast. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.